Hey guys, today I'll be making a little bit different video for y'all. So this video actually kind of goes in conjunction with the wonderful video Alex Ball did on the Polymoog. And I kind of want to make this video in conjunction with his because I thought this would be a good time to do this. And since I know a lot of people's curiosity will be up about the Polymoog. Now my videos are nowhere near as professional as his, but hopefully this will help some of you guys that are more interested in the technical aspect of the Polymoog. So, first things first. Is the Polymoog a synthesizer or is it an organ? Well, to be honest with you, they're both synthesizers. And that's how I've always looked at organs and subtractive synthesizers. An organ is additive. A Polymoog, or most synthesizers that we know of as synthesizer term, is subtractive. So yes, they're both synthesizers. The idea of the theory of operation is similar in ways, but then totally different in other ways. So really the only thing the Polymoog really has in conjunction with a organ, or as far as design goes, is divide down technology. That's really it. Everything else is strictly Polymoog, and I'll be explaining that as we go along here. So the Polymoog is very special to me personally, and I'll just kind of give you guys a little history that don't know who I am and kind of my story. But when I was starting out, I had just got out of high school, and I grew up listening to Gary Newman Cars here in America. You know, that was the big hit here in America. Didn't really know much about Gary Newman except the song Cars. And of course, like most of you guys that are Polymoog nuts, you love the Vox Humana sound. That's just that sound. It's just absolutely, the presence of that sound, as Alex has mentioned, is just insane. It's a sound unlike any other synthesizer that I've really heard. And so I fell in love with that sound, but it would be years and years and years later before I actually discovered it was a Polymoog. So by the time I was about 20, I had a bank account, which was dangerous. I had a YouTube account, an eBay account, which was even more dangerous. And then I actually developed a YouTube channel, and I bought my first Polymoog right out of high school. And I started making videos, which you can still find on my channel, going way back, to my restoration attempts as I was progressing in the restoration of my 280A at that time. And so I have the Polymoog to thank for my whole career change. Because out of high school I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I got so deep into electronics and the history of Moog music and the history of Dave Luce and just the history of everything. It was just all in one time. It's just like it just kind of came on me, and I just loved it. And so I actually majored in electronics in college because of the Polymoog. So it was a very special instrument to me personally because it absolutely was just changed. It just changed everything about my career. So it's a very special instrument to me personally for that reason. But also it has that sound. And I don't care, even if you don't like Vox Humana, there's other sounds that this thing does. That's just absolutely, it's really thick. People don't call it thick, but it's got a pretty thick sound to it when you get into programming it. So anyways, with that said, we'll start with what this thing is. So we'll start first with the top left board here, and I'll kind of explain what's going on here. And like I said, I'm not going to get real technical because I don't want to bore you guys with the complete technical aspect of it, but just a good idea of what you're looking at when you take the hood off this thing. So what this board is responsible for is the wave shape mixing, and then also the keyboard circuitry, the driver circuit for your keyboard, as well as the frequency modulations, as well as the pulse width modulation. And then we also have these two VCOs right here. And these are, I pointed all this because this is all part of the VCO circuits. And you have two of them because you have two oscillators in the synthesizer. So you have one that's dedicated to sawtooth, one that's dedicated to variable pulse wave. It's kind of how that works. And so these two are responsible for those two waveforms. Now these oscillators here are actually the ones that when you change frequency of anything, such as frequency modulation, pitch bend, you're actually controlling these VCOs here. And then what happens is it goes out to these phase lock loops, and it goes over here to these cards. So what these cards here are responsible for, they're HFO cards, high frequency oscillator cards. What they actually do is they take the frequency off the reference oscillators, and they actually make it into a CV voltage using a shelving filter. So it basically takes the frequency, makes a DC voltage, and then it goes into a voltage to current converter, because a VCO is actually current controlled, not voltage controlled, so it has to be a circuit to convert voltage to current, which is what a transistor does. and then it actually runs a VCO. So what this VCO on these cards do is they run at like 1 megahertz, so it's a really high frequency. And the reason for that high frequency is that they can actually drive a top octave synthesizer chip. And so the top octave synthesizer chip is exactly what it sounds like. It basically makes up a set of frequencies that gives you a whole octave, a really high frequency octave. And so that's what that oscillator is responsible for. And then at the same time, there's actually another divider circuit that actually sets your footage. For example, the sawtooth, you can hear that shift. That's taking place on this card here. And then what also happens is there's a feedback. So there's actually feedback frequency that's going back to this oscillator. And that's where the phase lock loop comes in. It locks kind of the frequencies so you keep an accurate tune between these two oscillators. That's the point. And so that's how the actual HFO cards work. Then we get into the actual divider card. And what I love about Moog too is you'll see all this is modular, meaning that every section comes out, it's got its own board. It makes it really nice, especially if you got to fix something. But what that board down there does, you can see the one that these plug into, you can see those rows of chips. Those are your dividers. And so basically what they do, they divide that top octave synthesizer frequency down to give you your octaves of your keyboard. So for example, all these F sharps are generated from those different stages of those dividers. And that's how that works. Since you got two oscillators, you got two of everything over here. So you got the white is dedicated to square wave, the brown is dedicated to sawtooth. Is how that works. So that's the actual frequency generation part of this Polymoog. Alright, now since we've talked about the frequency generation, which would be your oscillators, we're going to go down here to the lower motherboard and I'll explain these cards right here. So these cards are actually what holds your Polycom chip, which Alex had mentioned, and that's the actual chip that that Dave Luce and the team actually manufactured, or had manufactured for them. And it's a very special chip, and this is really what sets it apart from any string machine or any organ, or really any other kind of divide down technology here. So the big issue, and this is probably the biggest failure point of the Polymoog, believe it or not, is Dave and the team were so worried about those Polycom chips being a high failure rate because they were experimental, they were brand new design idea, and so they decided to go in and socket the card that had that chip on them. Well, guess where the failure point is? Not the chip. Those chips rarely fail. It's the sockets they put these cards in. And I explain it to people. It's like it's kind of like the old Mac Pros from like 2008, 2009, where sometimes you'd move the computer and you'd lose your RAM connection. You had to reset the tray that the RAM set in. Same aspect. And so what happens typically with Polymoogs is like when you move them, or you ship them or whatever, these cards will actually lose connection. They don't fall out. They just lose connection with those sockets a little bit. And you'll get a note that might be fuzzy. You'll get some brightness issues. You'll get some maybe a waveform that doesn't sound right, or you'll get a sustain issue. You'll actually get a note that may just sit there and just bleed constantly. And so you have to go find that note and reset the card. That's kind of how this works. So that's really the biggest failure point. But these cards are the Polycom chip in particular is very interesting. And these cards do quite a bit too. So what they're responsible for is actually each key has its own VCA. So the Polycom chip has a VCA in there, a brightness EQ, and that's actually how it controls the brightness of the sound depending on what preset you're in. You don't really have a control on the interface for brightness. It's actually programmed inside. But it's really just to help simulate the sounds of the presets that you're wanting to simulate the instrument of. So it gives it more of a brightness or a darker tone, etc. And so that's what that chip does. It also handles the waveforms. So it's actually where your frequency off those dividers are all square waves. So it comes over here, and this is actually where they actually get wave shaped into sawtooths and variable pulse waves. And so that's also what these cards are responsible for. And so like I say, this is what really separates the Polymoog from most other instruments, because each key also has its own circuitry for the envelopes or the contour, which also gives each key its own kind of characteristic. And each card can be a little bit different So it does give you a little bit of character per note, which is really interesting. So it's not really, I don't like to say it's a voiced architecture synthesizer, but it kind of is. It just doesn't have oscillators per key. It has the divider stage, and then it has the wave shapes for each key. So that's kind of how you can think of this thing. And so basically that's how that works. That's your lower motherboards. Then what also happens too is you can see that you have one of these per, and all these boards are hinged too, which is really nice. But basically you got a set of these cards for each octave. So each set of octaves of these keys have their own lower motherboard. That's how that works. And that's what makes up your keying circuit. So VCAs per key is really nice, because when you think about most string machines, they had one VCA and everything was summed into it. And so you would get this huge, bleed up of notes, and it could get muddy really quick. The Polymoog didn't really do that unless you had your decay release set all the way up, and this thing will sustain forever and it'll play every note, so it has unlimited polyphony, which is also really cool as part of having those VCAs per key, and also the divide down architecture. So that's just kind of cool. Then we move to the center board. So the center board is pretty simple. It's got fixed filters. So these are your fixed filters for each preset. And then it also holds the resonator section. So this is the resonator circuit here, which some of you have seen the video where I cut one of these out of a board and I made a synthesizers.com modular years ago. I made a module for synthesizers.com to make this actually a modular format. So that's what this board is responsible for. So pretty simple board. There's not much to it. Then we get to this board here, which is another more complex board. So this board here is responsible for your VCF, which you can actually see the transistor ladder right there. You can see these transistors here and all the resonant caps there, and that's your filter circuit. But it also handles your monophonic keyboard circuit, because it actually has another set of resistors in the keyboard that actually gives you a monophonic tone, which is actually used for the filter as well. So you bring this up and the filter will track the keyboard monophonically. That's how that works. So you got your filter, your keyboard circuit. You've got a LFO over here that actually is responsible for the filter, like your rate, amount, and also sample and hold. And so that's all contained in this board. And also you got a envelope generator for the filter. And of course Moog calls that contour. So Moog always calls it a contour, but it's actually the same thing as an EG, envelope generator. So it's got a tag decay sustain, and that's just a real simple little envelope generator. And then it also has a really cool feature for preset 1 only. So you've got a circuit right over here, and it's actually responsible for a CV voltage, a little envelope follower that actually gives preset 1 a modulation amount control. We'll just go to preset 1. I'll show you what this sounds like. So if we go here and open this up, of course it's direct audio out of the amps, it's not great, but you can hear how the modulation will come in, while off a note you'll hear it bleed out. So let me get this kind of set up here. Give it a little bit more sustain. You hear it dies out. And you can also see it in our beat light, which is the phase angle of the two oscillators, as you can see. So that's a really cool feature of this board as well. But that's basically what the Polymoog is. It's very complex, but you've got to remember, for 1976, this thing was major technology. A lot of integrated circuits were brand new to the market, and so you had a lot of failures because of that too. Because a lot of these op amps and these CMOS, logic chips and that kind of stuff, it was prone to have a huge amount of static failure. And of course Moog didn't think about static control till a little later, and they started adding grounds. And of course you can see I add a lot of grounds when I redo these things to try to give it a true earth ground, so it kind of helps with the static control. But it was notorious for people, especially back in the 70s, that put a shag rug on stage, walk across the stage, touch the interface, and zap, you blew out a logic chip, and now you're stuck. You got something stuck on or off, or something's just completely shorted out and won't work. So that was the failure point of these things. So it really was static that killed these things more than it was anything else. But like I say, you can rebuild these things today using modern components, which have a much better suppression of static, and of course adding all the grounds and updating some things. These things become very reliable. And so that's just kind of the history of what the Polymoog is there. You've also got these front boards, which I'll bring up, and this is where you can see all your programming. So this is all the programming nodes, and this is where I get into the Vox Humana mod. So as mentioned by Alex, that I do one mod. I have prototyped it, but I found that nobody used it because everybody went direct output, and that's the fixed filter for like when you go to the output of the 280A and you hear that nasally tone. So I just never do that. I found out I just leave this filter in there that's from the original Vibes. I take Vibes because it's the most simple preset. It's just a square wave, like a 50% duty cycle square wave with a little modulation. That's it. And I turn it into Vox Humana, and now you can hear. So there's Vox Humana. So as you can hear, it sounds great. And we got dynamics. So as you can hear. So that's how I get Vox Humana. And but yeah, it's just a look at the boards inside there. Of course, they're hard to service if you got to really service these things. This is probably the roughest area of a Polymoog to just have to repair, you know, rather than just do a restoration. But anyways, guys, I just thought this would be a cool video to go along with Alex Ball's video for those that are interested. And thanks for watching.